Do you have yellow and brown leaves on your vegetable plants? This does not necessarily mean that your plant is dying. Today, I want to talk about how to trim or prune your vegetable plants in your garden. I see a lot of people share pictures of their vegetable plants, and there's maybe one or two stems or leaves that are yellowing and dying off, and they think it means that their whole plant has a disease on it. This is not necessarily the case. In my experience as a gardener of over 7 years now, if you have leaves that are yellowing or brown, if it's just isolated to a few stems or leaves, those leaves just need to be pruned or trimmed off. If you have an issue where most of the plant is showing that issue, then yes, you maybe should be concerned. But a lot of times you just need to trim off individual leaves and stems. So let's go through my garden, and I'm going to show you today what I'm trimming and why. So starting with this squash plant, and squash is honestly, I feel like the vegetable plant that I do the most trimming on. These lower leaves are going to get yellow and brown, and there's a lot of different reasons for this. It might just be because they're not getting enough sunlight because they're underneath a lot of the other leaves. Sometimes it's because they're touching the soil and it might be creating an issue on them. But if you look at this plant, all the other leaves are healthy and green. There are no issues. It's really just this one leaf. And so in this case, I know that there's not a problem with my whole plant. I just need to trim it off. And like I said, with the squash plants, I find that I frequently need to just trim off the lowest leaves. So that's what I'm going to do on this one. It's important for airflow to be trimming back your stems. And the other reason it's important is because if you have dead or dying leaves or stems on your plants, that is going to attract pests, and it might lead to a pest issue. It also might be a fungus or a bacteria on that leaf, and so when you trim it off, that is going to make sure that it doesn't spread to other leaves or stems. This one is dying off. There's another one over here. I have some pole beans back here. If you could see in the video, a bunch of gnats actually just flew off when I moved that. So that's, again, another example where sometimes this kind of dying foliage is going to attract bugs that you don't necessarily want. But especially leaves like these where they're going to be closer to the ground, if leaves are sitting in the soil, they are very likely going to end up having some kind of an issue. So definitely check those that are lower to the soil. I will say be very careful when trimming, because even as a gardener of 7 years, I have accidentally cut the main stems when trimming off leaves. So you want to be really careful. I don't right off the bat see any stems that have to be trimmed. Now with tomatoes, it is recommended to kind of trim off any of these lower branches as the plant is getting taller. So with these plants here in this container, you can see they're pretty tall. And the reason why you can trim off some of these lower ones, one reason is because the reason that plants need leaves, and I'm going to take you back to your high school biology class, but the reason that plants need leaves is because the leaves is what takes in that sunlight and helps the plant to grow. And so if you take off all the leaves of a plant, it won't be able to take in that sunlight, and so that's going to be a problem. So when you have plants like tomatoes that get taller, the higher branches are shading these lower branches, so these aren't even really getting a lot of sunlight anyway. So a lot of these leaves that are not going to be leaves that might turn into flowers and then tomatoes, I'm going to go ahead and trim a lot of these off. But again, you really need to be careful and intentional with how you're doing this, because if you trim off too many of the leaves, it's not going to be able to take in all that sunlight that it needs to survive. My rule of thumb that I have always done is I don't trim off more than a third of the leaves of a plant at a time, or even like over the course of like several weeks. I did find one stem that was having some damage. So a lot of times on tomato plants, the lower stems will start to look like this and get kind of yellow and brown. And again, that's just because they're probably not getting enough sunlight. Go ahead and trim those off. Another reason to keep your plants pruned, especially the ones that grow upwards like tomato plants is that if you're a container gardener like me and you're trying to get a lot of vegetables out of your garden, you might have other plants that are lower to the ground growing beneath that plant. And so if you are trimming off, especially those lower leaves that aren't really needed anymore, then that is going to allow more sunlight to get to what is beneath them. So right here I'm growing bush beans underneath the tomato plant. So if I'm being good about pruning these lower leaves that again are not necessary, they're not bearing any flowers or tomatoes on them, that is going to allow more sunlight to get down onto those bush beans. So again, looking at this tomato plant in particular, there are still a lot of leaves up top, a lot of greenery up there. And so removing those lower stems and leaves is not going to negatively affect this plant as long as you are leaving enough of the other leaves to be able to get that sunlight and do that photosynthesis. So my main takeaway for you is first that if you see yellowing or browning leaves or stems, don't worry, it is not a sign that your whole plant is dying off. You just need to sometimes trim off those individual stems. And secondly, it's really important to be proactive in your garden, to be pruning and trimming off not only the dead and dying leaves, but also on plants where you just need to help with that airflow, things like tomatoes and peppers. The more that you're trimming off, especially those lower leaves and stems, the healthier your garden and your plants are going to be. I hope you have a great growing season this year.